Joining me now, fresh from today's hearing, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, Democrat of Texas, a member of the House Judiciary Committee. Congresswoman, what was the goal of today's hearing, and did you feel you accomplished it?
We absolutely did, and the goal, of course, was to take the American people and to take the record down the journey of obstruction. As you well know, Chris, the third article of impeachment for Richard Nixon was obstructing Congress. Now, that was not necessarily our start. We thought that Mr. Lewandowski would come and tell the truth. He was, in fact, in living color, the story that was told in the Mueller report. The American people haven't read the Mueller report. They got to see a living character who was actively engaged, although he was not an employee of the United States government, he was not an employee of the White House, but he was used by the president to sidestep the laws of the land. And that, I believe, throughout the entire day was very clear. It was very clear in his use of the letter that was given to us on the 16th that clearly was inappropriate because the confidentiality provisions that they referred to has to do with counsel to the president on making decisions of policy. To go and tell someone to change the Mueller investigation to elections in the future are not policy, it is obstruction. And we clearly watched Mr. Lewandowski as well create a pathway for the story of whether or not the President of the United States was trying to obstruct justice, which was all about what Director Mueller had in Volume 2. Remember now, he said, I cannot exonerate him, and it was all about the issues and the facts of obstruction.
There was a moment where he expressly invoked privilege to not answer a question about whether he discussed a pardon. I thought it was kind of an interesting tell. I want to play that moment and get your reaction. Take a listen.
Has the president ever offered you a pardon?
Again, the White House has directed not to disclose the substance of any discussions with the president or his advisors to protect executive branch confidentiality.
Okay.
What do you make of that?
Well, I make that he was well briefed by the White House and issues that he could answer. That had nothing to do with advising the president on the question of governance. It had to do whether you were asked for or you were given the idea that you could get a pardon. That's why we believe that there are several instances in which Mr. Lewandowski can be held in contempt. He used this privilege that was given to him by White House counsel in a letter that was inappropriate. And I really do think he was a living color witness to see the constant obstruction of justice, not by him, but by the White House.
Okay, but here's the problem, right? I mean, there were two witnesses called. The White House has asserted extremely broad power to stop witnesses, even people that are not currently working for the administration, to testify at all. The privilege that they are invoking here is extremely controversial in legal circles. In some cases, they're talking about a blanket immunity. You can't talk to anyone we don't want you to talk to. That's the fundamental issue. Like, you can't actually do this unless you break that. And the question is, how do you break that?
Well, you know, Chris, you're absolutely right. Be reminded of Speaker Pelosi's words: investigation, litigation, and legislation. We legislated last week with the impeachment investigation. We're in the courts. We insist that we have the right to question Mr. Porter, Mr. Dearborn, Mr. McGahn, and we believe with the impeachment investigation, we're hoping positively that we will prevail in court, not later, but sooner than later. The courts will see that we have nothing but obstruction, not from the particular witnesses, but from the President of the United States. I think that was more than clear, and you well know, because not only was he obstructing as instructed by the White House, but he launched his Senate campaign in New Hampshire. He launched a hashtag 2020. I mean, absolutely absurd. We cannot have witnesses disrespecting Article I body, which is the United States Congress.
There were several calls for him to be found in contempt. I read a former Congressman, Brad Miller, saying if you acted like this in court, you'd be in jail cooling your heels. Are you going to find him in contempt? It adjourned, I guess that's the chair's call, but it adjourned without that. But again, you keep saying you can't have this, but that's what you did have.
I believe we will be reviewing the record. And I frankly believe that Mr. Lewandowski has been in contempt of Congress. There were questions that he could answer. There were questions that were not applicable to the confidentiality protection. And there were questions that he knew full well were the truth. And the reason is he had it in his book, Let Trump Be Trump. He said it over and over again in television interviews. One interview, he said he had nothing to do, no one ever told him to contact Attorney General Sessions. And then here he is sort of alluding that he cannot answer that question because of privilege. Well, why didn't he say the same thing that he said in his interviews? I think it was more today than people might imagine. Again, President Nixon's third article of impeachment was obstructing Congress. Now we have a very colorful fella giving a colorful journey today of just how deep that obstruction is. I don't think the American people, I know they're busy, they're working, but I think if they get bits and pieces of this, they can say this is not the way you run a government or a country. The president should have those individuals no longer in the White House having the ability to come from the Article 1 body who has a right to proceed under the impeachment investigation for high crimes and misdemeanors or abuse of power and answer the questions and use the privilege only appropriately when you are counseling the president for something good dealing with the governance of the United States. We cannot be undermined in the investigatory process.
All right, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, Chris.